Hello and welcome. In this episode, we will dive into a topic that is black and white and shimmering all over by discussing the practical and magical origins of the word glamour. Officially, glamour comes to us by way of Scotland, though there are many variations and related words in both English and French, a few of which we will be touching on, in addition to discussing its intrinsic relation to Latin. But ultimately, we will be tracing this word back to the ancient Greek, grammatiki. Although surprising, there is nothing humble about the origin of glamour, which, much like today, was associated mainly with the upper echelons of society. However, where modern culture would think of celebrities and influencers, in the beginning, it was only the learned and literate who could wield the power of glamour. The word was first coined in Scotland around the dawning of the 18th century and was used to describe something as magical or an enchantment. Now, enchantment itself comes from the Old French encantement, which means magical spell, song, concert, or chorus, from the verb enchanter, to bewitch or charm. This is a descendant of the Latin incantare, meaning to cast a magic spell upon. To break this down further, incantare comes from the Proto-Indo-European root in, meaning in or upon, and cantare, meaning to sing, which is derived from the pie, can, also meaning to sing. What this implies is that there is a verbal component to glamour. There are words or incantations which are necessary to casting a glamour as it was initially used at the word's inception. You see, glamour was originally a variant of the word gramarye, a magic enchantment or spell, the Scottish alteration of the English word grammar. In the modern sense, we generally think of grammar as being a system of rules for the usage of language, but up until the 19th century, it had a much broader definition, being the general study and understanding of the Latin language. This is because Latin was thought of, at least in Europe, as being the universal language of learning. This is despite, or possibly because of, the fact that most people did not actually know Latin. Let's explore this. The official language used in ancient Rome was Latin, also referred to as Classical Latin. However, with an empire that conquered enough territory to eventually reach from the British Isles all the way to Syria, it is not surprising to find that there were other languages and dialects that were used colloquially by its citizens. Even just on the Italian peninsula, where Latin originated, there were a handful of other languages such as Umbrian, Oscan, Pelasgian, and Greek. During the Classical period, thought of as being between the 8th century BCE and the 5th century CE, there were three known types of Latin that were commonly used: Classical Written Latin, for formal documents, Classical Oratorical Latin, for speeches and public speaking, and Colloquial Latin, for the average speaker's everyday use. This colloquial form allowed room for the language to mutate, and over the years it continued to evolve, altering pronunciation, vocabulary, and even grammar, while Classical Latin remained the same. Towards the end of the Classical period, around 300 CE, the common tongue of the Roman Empire had been altered so much that it had more or less become its own entity, known as Vulgar Latin, a looser, more malleable language that was able to grow and evolve with its users. And indeed, Vulgar Latin was subject to a great deal of change, and it saw many variations over the years, making it a difficult language to define or standardize. But with the understanding of the fluidity of this language, and deviations and variations across time and distance, scholars are able to extract important information about the evolution of many European languages. Because of this, when we look at Vulgar Latin through a modern lens, we see it as something other than just a lazy form of Latin or a haven of ancient slang. We see it as proto-Romantic, an ancestral language that functions as the link between Latin and the Romance languages that we are familiar with today. This language family includes French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. English is not considered to be a Romance language, though it has been very heavily influenced by the Romance languages. From the end of the Classical period through the end of the Middle Ages, thought to be between the 13th and 15th centuries, this colloquial language continued to evolve into the languages that we now associate with the various regions of mostly Western and Southern Europe. Those dialects became the means of communication in their respective areas, with Latin continuing to become further and further removed from the daily lives of the people who inhabited the former Roman Empire. But Latin was not dead. For centuries, it remained the language of scholars and functioned as a standardized form of communication in these circles, and it was still the official language of the Catholic Church. What this means is that the Word of God and the Word of scholars was being handed down to the common people from a script which they could not read, in a language which they could not speak. Although, to be fair, the inability to read Latin had less to do with the language and more to do with the general lack of literacy among most Europeans at the time. You may recall in our episode covering the word Carolingian, we discussed Charlemagne's work to improve his own literacy, as well as that of the entire Holy Roman Empire. Because for the majority of human history, literacy was rare, and in medieval Europe, it was not that reading was a sign of aristocracy, but instead, it was that literacy was mainly relegated to academics and clergy. These barriers meant that the written language, and especially Latin, a language that was not commonly spoken, evoked a sense of mystery and apprehension for many people. All of this is to say, on the British Isles, where people spoke English or a variation such as Scots English, the Latin language would have seemed very foreign despite its use within the Church. And the language's ability to decree the word of God or spread new information in the various fields of academia would have made it feel as though the words had a certain amount of underlying power to them. And since this knowledge was only attainable by a select few initiates, it was almost completely out of reach to the masses, making these positions in society inherently powerful. Because of this power, the people in these positions were regarded with reverence and suspicion. Now, as mentioned, fundamentally the study of grammar was the study of Latin, and to have grammar was to have an understanding of the Latin language. But there was so much mystery surrounding the written word and those who understood it that there seems to have been this assumption that those with grammar also partook in more occult practices. In addition to reading in general, the study of grammar at the time was thought to have included learning about magic and astrology as well. Through this connection of magic and literacy, we come to a word that ties the two concepts together and is actually closely related to the word glamour, both sharing the same linguistic lineage. Grimoire. A grimoire is more or less a spellbook, a written manual of magic and witchcraft used to hold information on spells, how to create magical objects, instructions for rituals, how to invoke demons and summon spirits, etc. It seems that these texts function similarly to how we think of grammar today, offering information on magical symbols or incantations, as well as instructions on how to properly employ them in order to successfully produce the desired effects. There are some grimoires that claim to date back hundreds of years, even back to ancient Egypt, but the word comes to us from French around the mid-1800s as an altered form of the word grammaire, which meant incantation or grammar. This word made its way over to Britain, inspiring the English alteration of gramarye, which had specific connotations to magic and occult learning. This later became our previously mentioned gramarye, the precursor to glamour. Glamour actually has quite a large family tree, all connected through the ancient roots of the word grammar. Let's take a look. As mentioned at the top of the episode, glamour comes from the Scottish gramarye, meaning enchantment or spell, which was a corruption of the English grammar. Grammar itself is a derivation of the Old French grammaire, meaning grammar or learning, with special emphasis on the learning of Latin and philology, the study of linguistics and literary texts. This form evolved into the modern French grammaire, which was mentioned earlier. But the root of this word would be the Latin grammatica, which also means grammar or philology. This classical Latin term is taken from the Greek grammatiki, with the first half of the word gramma being the Greek word for letter, and the second half coming from techne, meaning art, which would make grammatiki the art of letters. It is from here that we get the suffix gram, which is a morpheme that can be added to indicate that something is written or drawn. For example, telegram, which is the written message conveyed by a telegraph. Other words that come from the same root would be diagram, anagram, and even Instagram, along with countless others. But it should be of no surprise that the mechanics of grammar have always had a heavy influence over the magic of glamour. The word spell traces back to Old English's spell, which meant a story, narrative, prose, history, discourse, fable, or command, along with Late Old English, where it could be used to indicate a sermon or religious instruction. Spell, in both cases, can be credited to the German influence on the English language, coming from the Old Saxon spell, which was taken from Old High German spell, which was ultimately derived from the Proto-Germanic spellum. From as early as 1200 CE, this was understood as being a set of words with presumed magical powers, a charm, or an incantation. Even the 14th century poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who penned the Canterbury Tales, wrote of a night spell in reference to a charm for protection from evil spirits in the night. Likewise, the verb form of spell is also derivative of this same term. However, this form of the word evolved separately. It was thought that spellum may have evolved to the Frankish spellon, from which Old French derived espellir, meaning to mean, signify, explain, or interpret. This transitioned into the Anglo-French espeler, which later became spellin around the 14th century. By then the word had come to mean to form words by means of letters, therefore linking magic spells to spelling bees. Style is another word that intersects grammar and glamour, with an etymology that derives its origins from the Latin stylus, which was the word for writing instrument. This is echoed in French with the word stylo, meaning pen. But the evolution from stylus to style seems to have occurred over a number of centuries, beginning as an instrument with which to write and graduating to writing in general, then a manner of writing, then to the mode of expression within writing, later to manners of expression in activities other than writing, before finally arriving at distinctive modes of external expression and presentation. Which brings us to charm. This comes from charmen, which is to recite or cast a magic spell, from the Old French charmer, meaning to enchant or fill with desire, but can also be used in reference to both protecting or doing harm. This comes from the late Latin carminare, which is derived from the Latin carmen, a song, verse, or enchantment, from the verb canare, to sing, which is a descendant of the Proto-Indo-European can, also meaning to sing. The idea behind this being the chanting or reciting of words to invoke magical power. Although gramarye and glamour had been in use in Scots English for some time, Sir Walter Scott is credited with bringing the term and its magical connotation to the masses in his 1805 poem, The Lay of the Minstrels, where he uses the term in reference to an elf, creating a link between glamour and the Fae, writing, "The iron band, the iron clasp, resisted long the elfin grasp, for when the first he had undone, it closed as he the next begun. Those iron clasps, that iron band, would not yield to unchristened hand, till he smeared the cover over with the borderer's curdled gore. A moment then the volume spread, and one short spell therein he read. It had much of glamour might, could make a lady seem a knight. The cobwebs on a dungeon wall seem tapestry in lordly hall. A nutshell seem a gilded barge, a shieling seemed a palace large, and youth seemed age, and age seemed youth. All was delusion, naught was truth." In this verse, Scott establishes glamour as being of a magical nature, and he ties the concept of it to the folklore surrounding fairies. A common glamour associated with such creatures is the use of illusion, which can come into play with beings referred to as changelings, which are offspring of fae that are swapped out by the fairies for human infants. People believed that they might be able to have their original child returned to them either by making the changeling laugh or by torturing it. Unfortunately, this belief is thought to be responsible for instances of child abuse and even infanticide. But they were also regarded as having other illusory magic, such as that mentioned in the Lay of the Minstrels. And that illusion brings us full circle to the glamour of today. The Hollywood facade of being perpetually camera ready, the stylists, the glam squads, cosmetics, surgeries, fillers, filters, the curation of our image, whether that be our person, our home, or our life. The desire to be considered in some way glamorous, to be alluring and fascinating and attractive, is pervasive and pernicious and captivating all at once, like magic. But there is another creature of lore connecting glamour to the smoke and mirrors of old Hollywood that we have yet to discuss. Sirens. The sirens of the silver screen, forever glamorized by the nostalgia of cinema's gold age, owe their moniker to the fearsome and beguiling nymphs who perched on an island in the sea, waiting for the opportunity to lure sailors to their deaths. The lore of the sirens is a bit murky. They are thought to be sisters, though their parentage is uncertain. Believed to be between a muse and a lesser ocean god, however, varying accounts offer different possibilities. Even their form changes from story to story. Although today they may be conflated with mermaids, the actual mythos portrays the sirens as having much more in common with the bird-like harpies. Both had been rendered as large birds with the head of a woman. However, the appearance of the sirens altered from one account to another. Some were women with wings, others with bird legs, yet in older depictions, they were not birds at all. Originally companions to the goddess Persephone, myth states that the sirens were transformed into birds by Demeter, Persephone's mother, after their goddess was carried off by Hades, god of the underworld. In some tellings, this transformation was given as a punishment. In others, it was to allow the sirens to help Demeter search for her daughter. Either way, from then on, the sirens were portrayed with bird-like attributes. And no, it doesn't sound very glamorous. The sirens of Greek mythology are almost unrecognizable when compared to how we use the word now. But even if they weren't beautiful, the sirens were still alluring. If we go back to the Scottish roots of glamour, it was used to describe a spell or enchantment. Just as a quick reminder, enchantment traces its lineage back to the Latin incantare, from cantare meaning to sing. The sirens never bewitched anyone with their appearance, but instead with their voice. The idiom siren song that we use to describe something calling us towards it, whether that be a person, place, or a mission, is describing this enchantment and how it draws us in. In Homer's The Odyssey, the goddess Circe warns Odysseus to beware the call of the Sirens, who lured sailors to their doom on the rocky shores of their island, but she didn't tell him to avert his eyes. She instructed Odysseus to stop up his crew members' ears with wax, so they would not be ensorcelled and jump into the deep waters in pursuit. And she informed him that if he wished to hear the song of the Sirens for himself, he should tie himself to the mast of the ship, out of reach of the wheel, so he could not steer the boat into the rocks. Trusting Circe, our hero took heed and did just as she said, making Odysseus one of the very few to hear the Sirens singing and live to tell the tale. And according to Homer, this is what the Sirens had to say. While to the shore the rapid vessel flies, celestial music warbles from their tongue, and thus the sweet deluders tune the song. O stay, O pride of Greece, Odysseus, stay. O cease thy course and listen to our lay. Blessed is the man ordained our voice to hear. The song instructs the soul and charms the ear. Approach, thy shall into raptures rise. Approach and learn new wisdom from the wise. We know whatever the kings of mighty name achieved at Troy in the field of fame. Whatever beneath the sun's bright journey lies, O stay and learn new wisdom from the wise. The song that the Sirens sang was that of knowledge. Their offering was not beauty but wisdom. Mysterious and compelling, just as Latin was centuries later, the foreign but never far off language of gods and scholars. Thank you so much for listening all the way through if you did. Please leave a like if you would like to hear more episodes. Also feel free to leave a comment if there are any other words you would like to see covered in the future.